Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are waiting on a few more participants to join us here on Zoom. Thank you so much for your patience. We'll get started here in a few minutes. Hello, everyone. We're now ready to get started. Commissioners and panelists, I'm now turning on your ability to start your audio and your video.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you. It's about 3 minutes after 1 o'clock, so I think we should go ahead and be mindful of your time and your contribution and start our meeting. This is the June 29, 2021 advisory meeting on California law enforcement training. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. We also have some other commissioners who are with us. We have Janet Sidley, who is the chair of our law enforcement training study. We have vice chair Sean Varner, and I see Commissioner David Byer. Ethan, have I missed any other commissioners who are participating? I don't think so.
I don't believe so, Mr. Chairman. I think that's everyone.
Thank you very much. Also today is the commission staff. We have Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, who will moderate our discussion, as well as our analysts Rachel Ioli and Ashley Hurley. Today's meeting follows a series of hearings we held earlier this year to learn about the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, or POST, and to explore what more we could or should be doing as a state to improve law enforcement training. Though many decisions about how law enforcement operates in California are left to individual communities, the state plays a critical role in setting minimum training standards for all law enforcement officers in the state through the POST Commission. We've invited groups of academics, researchers, and current law enforcement officials here today to seek their input on a number of issues that come prominently in our hearings. I'd like to thank our meeting participants for sharing their time and their expertise with us. I'd also like to explain there may come a time during this meeting when I have to step away. I have been asked to testify in support of legislation before a Senate committee. But before we begin our discussion, let's turn it over to Commissioner Sidley to share some more about today's agenda.
Thank you, Chairman Nava. Appreciate that. And I want to welcome and thank everybody who is here today attending our advisory discussion. From our previous meetings, as Commissioner Nava has indicated, we have learned more often than not, much attention is applied to how many hours we do in training, and maybe a little less attention is applied to either the quality of the training or the outcomes of the procedures and process of the training. And we've heard across the profession that there is little research that is currently connected to the training that officers receive and with police behavior on the job. And the training that officers receive often, but not always, but often, may fail to incorporate the lessons of the rigorous academic research that we have been looking at. As a result, it's difficult to make sure that as a state, we're investing in the works and what works for officers on the job and the communities in which they protect and serve. So what we are hoping to look at today is how we can do more as a state to shift the conversation and potentially resources towards investing in an evidence-based training for California law enforcement. Through our hearings, we have heard of the many challenges that spring up around training and timing of when training is provided and the content required of the training. California, as you all know, invests heavily in training before officers begin their careers and focuses much attention on training officers in basic academics. New training requirements often mean reducing content elsewhere. We've also heard departments experience challenges with funding and/or backfill while people are at training. As a result, some have trouble providing robust continuing education for officers throughout their careers. As a result, in a disparity of training across the state, which some said needs to be addressed through greater standardization, we'd like to explore, do officers receive the right kind of training and at the right times? We also want to know if the required training emphasizes the right skills or if, in your view, things may be missing. There's a lot of opportunity for us to start thinking about what the role of the state of California could play in addressing some of these problems and how the Post Commission can help address these challenges. Our goal today is to generate ideas and potential strategies that the state could use to augment evidence-based training for California peace officers and to assure that officers are given the tools and resources that they need and when they need it to be effective guardians of the community. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your time and expertise with us today to consider these important questions. And before we do launch into the discussion, I'd like to ask Tamar, please, to go over some of the housekeeping issues that will guide today's conversation. Thank you all again very much.
Thank you again, Commissioner Sibley and everyone for being here. I just have a few housekeeping items. This actually is our very first virtual advisory meeting, so I appreciate all of you for being part of this historic step in the Commission's process today. Just to go over some new guidelines for this meeting, how we'll run it. Today's meeting is meant to be a true discussion among the participants. Our goal here is not to try and reach consensus about what any one recommendation should or should not be, rather to generate conversation and ideas about issues that the Commission may consider as it's weighing what the Commission would like to recommend for California in this space. So we hope that we'll encourage a frank discussion today and would just encourage you to participate as freely as you feel possible. Also for our participants today, your audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the meeting. However, we'd ask that you keep yourself muted while you're not speaking. We also will be using the raised hand feature to establish a queue for speakers. So if you would like to make a comment, please just indicate that using the raised hand feature in Zoom, and we'll add you to the queue so that we can get the conversation going in that way. I will say though that at times our commissioners, just like at our hearings, if you've watched our hearings, might jump in with questions, and so please expect that might happen as well. We also have opened up the chat feature today in Zoom, and that is so that any of you, if you feel it would be helpful, might share a link if you wanted to reference some material. So that will be available to all of the folks participating, as well as viewable by those members of the public who are watching us online. So that resource will be accessible to them. They will not be able to add into the chat, however. And for folks who are following along online, thank you for watching and joining us today. We have an agenda and the list of participants available on our website. We're going to keep, just like our hearings, we'll keep the members of the public muted for the duration of the conversation. However, we will have a public comment period following the end of our discussion where we will invite members of the public to give a few comments if they'd so like to do that. And we'll provide instructions at that time on how to do that for them. So finally, our meeting today will be recorded. So we'll archive it on our website as a resource to those in the meeting and those watching. We'll have it on our website and on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. So there'll be multiple ways to view the discussion afterwards. So with that, Chairman Nava, Commissioner Sibley, I'd like to begin our discussion today with everybody. Our first topic is how could California Post incorporate evidence-based policing training into training standards and professional development. So we heard in our research earlier that to better align training with what research suggests are effective practices, experts said Post may need to evaluate existing training courses to determine if the lessons align with their evidence from research. Some also have told us that California may need to increase opportunities for officers to actually practice what evidence suggests works. To get us started, let me just pose this question to all of you, and that's how should California's Post incorporate an evidence-based approach to law enforcement training? If possible, I'd like to get as specific as we can in terms of what policies, resources, partnerships, or other structure might be needed to support this shift away from a focus on training hours to training outcomes. So with that, I'll open that to the group.
Well, I suppose the other part to that is who says you're not doing it now? Just to be a little bit provocative, because what we're hearing is that we need some evidence-based training, but I'm wondering whether or not there are some of you who already feel that there is evidence-based training in one form or another, and maybe it's not being recognized as such. Or the other part to that is there isn't enough evidence-based training upon which we can rely. And I'm not sure how we're going to do this, but I see John Lewis is unmuted, and normally when I'm doing a meeting, that says to me that they didn't want to say.
Well, thank you, Chairman. And I, in this circumstance, I was unmuted because I didn't properly follow Tamar's instructions. So I'm waiting to to hear, and I'm happy to contribute, but I was not in line in the queue. But thank you, sir.
Not at all. When we conduct our commission hearings, I look to commissioners' microphones to see who's unmuted, because that usually gives me a signal that they have something they want to say.
Mr. Nava, I can just jump in here. It looks like we have Professor Jack Glaser from UC Berkeley who'd like to make a comment, followed by Professor Emily Owens from UC Irvine. So.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here in my living room. I just wanted to. I don't have any easy answers. This is a very hard question, but I wanted to provide some definitional distinction that might help guide the discussion a little bit, and that's to draw a distinction between evidence-based work and evidence-informed or research-informed work. And I think generally speaking, when we talk about evidence-based, we're talking about practices that have been tested directly, and it's rare that we have that in police training, that we actually have outcomes data that looks at the differential effects of different kinds of trainings or some kind of randomized controlled trial kind of thing. So that's rare. It's difficult to achieve. Sometimes we have proximal measures like questionnaire measures. How effective do you think this training was? Or measures of performance during training. But it's rare that we have good data on the effect of training on performance in the field. However, there is a way to use research informed or to be informed by the research and the evidence to make smart decisions about what is likely to work and what isn't likely to work. And I'll come back to this later. I don't want to divert the discussion too much, but I have a lot to say on that subject with respect to implicit bias training and the expectations that that would have an effect on performance in the field when the evidence base from the scientific research indicates that it's very unlikely that anything that you can do in a training environment is going to actually reduce the impact of implicit bias. So that's one case where I feel like I have enough expertise to speak with some degree of confidence on the subject. But again, I just wanted to sort of start out by saying I think it's useful to distinguish between the ways that the evidence can inform the training, and sometimes it's very direct, but that's rare, and more often it's indirect. And I'll just end my comments at that.
Thank you.
All right, hi. Since Tamar named me after Jack, I'll jump right in. So one thing that I would like to point out, and this is again a little bit definitional, but something that has been observed in multiple contexts, by which I mean, in nursing homes and hospitals, we have observed this in the educational setting. If you measure people along a set of outcomes, they will tend to perform in ways to meet those outcomes. Right, so that's not necessarily in the policing context, but there have been a fair number of studies within the economics of health and the economics of education that have shown that to be true. And something that I think we were probably all struck by during the commission's hearings on this is how POST currently evaluates training is focused on number of hours that officers take courses, and at times officer or command staff satisfaction with courses. Right? If those are the outcomes that we are evaluating training on, that is what training is going to do. It's going to sort of end up naturally maximizing hours and maximizing officer satisfaction. And I think that most of us probably actually want training to do something different. Right, are perhaps at this moment in time looking for sort of, training that can support some sort of police reform, right, or support effective crime reduction. And so I think it would be very helpful to develop an evidence-based training, or in developing evidence-based training, to clearly specify what we want the outcomes to be, and then think very carefully about the costs and benefits of failing to link things like program participation or training courses to the outcomes that we want to observe, which are primarily, I think, officer behavior in the field. And I know there's a lot of sort of institutional barriers to linking what officers do in the field to what they've done in training and the supervision that they receive. And so, those costs are real, but I think also the benefits of being able to evaluate training based on the outcomes that we want to observe are likely quite large, based on what I've observed in education and healthcare.
So that's a way of saying you have to define your target, right? You have to say,
yes, exactly.
As we say, we're looking at the outcomes. For me, it's a way of saying, what's the target? What are we aiming for? Mm-hmm. What result do we want? Because
exactly.
Because you can pretty much set up anything to get whatever result you want, depending on what you're asking for.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
I think
go ahead.
Oh no, I think it's also interesting to think about training that is tactical. That I think in some ways when you're trying to develop sort of officers' muscle memory and how to effectively deploy their weapons, right? Those are things I think that that are relatively easy to measure within the academy, right? But other types of skills we might want, like training officers in problem solving, right? And how to really think about how their actions are meeting sort of crime reduction goals. Why do people engage in crime, right? Why do people not engage in crime? What are the consequences of my decision as an officer to make an arrest or a citation? Thinking about how we might expect to see officers trained in those types of problem solving skills in the field, I think is something to sit through and think about, and figuring out what that target is going to be.
Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have Professor Christy Lopez.
Thank you all, and thank you so much for having me here today. I actually grew up in California, born and raised there, went to UC Riverside, and my dad was a homicide detective with the NIMPD for 30 years. So this issue is both near and dear to my heart. I thought I was gonna just have something to follow up on what Professor Glaser was saying, but I actually have something to follow up on what Professor Owens was saying as well. I want to just emphasize that the distinction between evidence-based and evidence-informed is one of the reasons it's important is that it can be used, requiring that something be evidence-based can be used as an obstacle to innovation and really transforming policing. So even as we all are absolutely appropriately focused on trying to get training in there that actually is shown to be effective, we have to be mindful of how to do that in a way that doesn't stymie change in policing. And one thing I often say is that no one asked for an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, before we embarked on mass incarceration, and we shouldn't let the lack of one stand in the way of dismantling it. And I think we have to think about that when we're trying to change policing, even as we hold ourselves to a higher standard and try to test what we're doing. And I'm going to use the example of a program I co-run out of Georgetown called the ABLE Project, the Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement Project. And I've got two of the members of my research advisory board here today, Dr. Kazee and Dr. Glaser. And ABLE, we try to train officers using that sort of tactical scenario-based training, muscle memory that Professor Owens is talking about, to actually teach them how to intervene to prevent officers from other officers from causing harm. But it's based on social science research done in different fields, right? In testing done in medicine, in the airline industry, that has been done in graduate school labs across the country for literally many decades, but it's never before been applied to policing. To me, that's one example of how something can be evidence informed. We can't say, oh, we have to know it works before we try it, or we'd never try it, right? So we're trying it in a new area, but we do have reason to think that it should work. And then the reason why we have a research advisory board is that now we're going to try to study that and figure out whether it's having the impact that we want it to. And that's partly where it gets into what Professor Owens was talking about, because I think there's two things to be measuring, I think, and if people are more skilled in this, can offer more nuance to this. But you want to both know, you need to be testing whether the delivery of the training is such that officers are actually getting from it what you think they should be getting from it. And that's actually something we're working on right now. How do you actually come up with evaluations that will tell you, are officers actually learning this stuff? And they can't be like, can you define diffusion of responsibility, right? And that too much of testing for police training is along those lines, right? What's the definition of a passive bystander versus an active bystander? That's not going to tell you anything about whether they're actually learning what you need them to know to have a difference. So that's one part of how we need to, I think, evaluate this and be thinking about how we and have validated tests. And so part of the evidence-informed bit is like, how do you know that that test is working? And then you also have to evaluate, all right, is this actually influencing officer conduct in the field? We're really hopeful that it's really, really, really hard to test whether something is actually influencing officer conduct in the field. And so you often have a lot of surrogates for that. Are we influencing officer attitudes? Much easier to measure, but doesn't really get to you to what where the rubber hits the road, which is it changing conduct? So I think, addressing those challenges and trying to figure out how to, when you just can't answer a question you'd like to answer, and when you have to keep trying, is part of the challenge here, but a really key part to continuing to have our training evolve and improve, so that we are providing the training that's actually going to change the experience of policing for people in communities.
Commissioner Byer, I wanted to make sure we get to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Professor Lopez. I appreciate that your colleague, Rosa Brooks, wrote a great book, Tangled in Blue. And thank you for that. I want to pick up on the theme about using knowledge from training in other contexts. And the two examples that come to mind for me, one is I have a good friend who was a Delta Force commander. And Delta Force, they're pretty tough guys. They are physically fit, but I asked him what the hardest thing was to train people around. And he said, using your imagination. And that is adapting to changed circumstances. And if you think about Atul Gawande and his checklist for doctors, one of the things that I worry about, and I worry about in the context of this study, is that we may be asking police trainers to do too much. That is, to solve all of society's problems or solve all of the police reform needs. And what I'm thirsty for and would like to hear more about, what are the crossover skill development from other professions that could be added to post? Because one of the things that I think there's a risk of is that the legislature, or even us, the Little Hoover Commission, we just add another log on the fire. It's a post, and it's another course, it's another obligation, creating another conflict. And we're not adding some new insights from other professions where it's very clear for doctors that checklists make sense. Wash your hands, check your instruments, those kinds of things. Very hard to get doctors to comply unless you focus on it. So I'm wondering whether there are insights from these other occupations that we should focus on instead of just focusing on the police academy training component.
Thank you, Commissioner Byer. I want to get to Dr. Pinnell and then Dr. Kesey, and then hopefully we can address some of Commissioner Byer's questions.
Good afternoon. I think I'm going to kind of narrow the focus a little bit and very specifically talk because as the Director of Police Training for LAPD, we have a wide range of officers that we have to keep certified. And some of the things that when you ask how could post help us, most departments don't have a research component. And if they do, it's not robust. And, you know, I look at some of my partners here on this call and people that I've had to reach out and say, what are you doing? What are you doing? How do you do this? But most police departments don't have the sustained attention that it takes to do a full research project. By the time you start something, you have a changeover in command, and it takes 2 years to get your research fully vetted and evaluated. So some of that long-term component, I would love to see post really invest and look in the research on what we've been doing for the last 25 years. We've had a perishable skills program that has required 24 hours of training for every officer in the state, 4 hours on tactical firearms, 4 hours on driving, 4 hours on arrest and control, and 2 hours on communications. My concern has been, okay, so what is our return on the investment of making every officer do this in the state of California for over 25 years? It was already in place when I got here. And I'm specifically going to, again, for perishable skills, I think all these things were put into place by legislation for all really good reasons at the time, but I haven't seen us go back and really assess what we must have data somewhere. How is our driving? Are we better? And driving has changed. Cars have changed. We're now in SUVs versus, you know, where we started. But I would just say a really practical level that most people don't realize is the 4 hours of driver training. So first of all, I question if that's a perishable skill. Most of us don't forget how to drive within a year. And most of us are driving every day. So what is the perishable skill that we're trying to reinforce? For most agencies, and mine included, our recruits are on the track. So we can't get them on the track. So everyone's coming up with, to meet this requirement, we have to do other things. So now we're in a parking lot, but to get the level of people through, we're doing slow driving training for 4 hours every 2 years. That's a huge, and I just question the evidence base that I'd love to see is what's our return on investment, number one. And number two, I don't think anyone was protesting last year because of our parallel parking skills. We have huge issues in this country. And I just, and I don't think it's Post's fault. Post is implementing what has been given to them and passed down. But what I don't see is, as a state, that we're going back to look at why was this implemented? Did we reach that goal? What are our new goals? you just look at how exponentially we have put more things in a car, but those are all distraction items. But I just question if our training is changing that outcome. And I know that we have a 2-hour pursuit review that we also have to do on an annual basis, and that's done online. So we actually have 6 hours devoted to driving, but in a 2-year period, you're doing actually 8 hours, because you do that 2-hour online course each year. So that's an annual requirement. So I would love to see that reassessed, especially when I'm glad to see the other 4-hour use of force perishable skill come into play. I think that's moving in the right direction. The other question that I have with strategical communications, I think they've changed the name of it. And I know we're just in the midst of a change here, so I don't want to put anyone at post on edge, but for years, we've tried to incorporate tactical communications into our courses, but to meet that requirement, many agencies will just do the post online course. And I have a question about evidence-based practices. If communication is something that we need to do with each other, how do we do that online? So we meet some things online and some things in person. And I would just love to see that reassessed. And also, if we could track through the state, what is our return on that investment? And are there other things that we could direct that to? The other question I would have, or not question, with the many mandates that we have, even though the perishable skills program is supposed to be 14 hours with 10 hours of CPT, we are required an 8-hour first aid program. And then with the, I think what I count, we have 28 hours of mandated training to take in 20, so that is without doing anything. That's not immediate action, rapid deployment. That's not, those are just taking care of our post basic skills. So then doing things that create imagination, we want our instructors to do that. And lastly, I would say with the recent ways in which post could help us. Most people in law enforcement, I always say that most of my officers, I don't see anyone come into law enforcement saying, I hope I can write a lesson plan. That'd be so awesome. That's just not why they come into law enforcement. So one of the things on perishable skills, it says that post does not provide testing or evaluation materials. And I would say that maybe, I think that's done to help us have a breadth of ability to have flexibility with our courses. And while I appreciate that, I'd love to see a buffet of testing and evaluation materials, because I'm relying on SMEs who might be very good at a skill set, but they are not, by background, they're not curriculum designers, test creators. So then sometimes you create tests and you look at them afterward and you go, well, did we really test what we were trying to test? So how can our outcomes be, kind of back, making a stronger link to our outcomes? So I hope I didn't go on too long there, but those are a couple of things that I thought were, that we could even look back on things that we've done to help us for where we need to move forward.
Dr. Kesey, I wanted to get to you, and then Commissioner Sidley, you had your hand raised for a second, so I want to make sure. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And always my colleague Luann and I used to have these conversations when I was the Commissioner of Training for NYPD. And I +1 everything that you said. And I want to back up just a little bit too. When we talk about what are the things that I think posts can provide, and I think they do provide what I consider to be sort of the balance in the storm. While everybody's trying to figure out which end to go to, they can provide that direction and help guide people into really moving towards what I believe is necessary in training. And that is, I want to say, Christy mentioned this, and this is outcomes based. The community is asking, they've been begging for decades for us to prove that what we teach in that academy is either creating, exacerbating, or resolving what they believe those issues are. We can't answer those questions. We still can't answer those questions. After 30 years, we still can't answer the question. And I think that when I hear what Luann is asking for in regards to going back and looking at what are we considering perishable versus, not, the number one thing that we always look at and we continue to look at is how we talk about tactics, how we talk about what's necessary for officers, officer safety. And we really focus and although it's extremely important, but the overemphasis in some spaces on what we try to convey to those recruits almost becomes all consuming for them, and everything else sort of goes out the window. So re-looking at the number of hours that post requiring folks to go through and making sure that those are lining up with what's truly happening on the street. The community is asking for a different type of policing today, and there's been very little budging on the number of hours that we're using to do different types of training. And so that is a space I think Post could absolutely step up and sit down and figure out, what do we have, what's working, as Luann mentioned, and what do we need to do? I also want to add, it's not just, we don't train cops to do curriculum and we really work on SMEs, but this is an opportunity for, I think, Post to look at all areas of training, including who the trainers are. One of the biggest issues that I know we contend with is that we would love for people to be able to train officers, but not everybody is a trainer, nor should they be. And having some way to either evaluate or provide training or to guide training in some way for academy instructors is going to be crucial, no matter what changes you make. One of the things that we would always deal with in NYPD, and I think most academies do, and that's shadow training. You can have all the great curriculum in the world and it can all be evidence-based or evidence-influenced, but when I've got somebody telling a story that happened 20 years ago that is no longer applying, but it's impacting the ability for the recruits to focus and to really begin to incorporate or at least learn and absorb what we want them to learn, it's a blocker. It always has been. And I think that one of the things that we think about for Post, at least I can speak from, from the work that I've done and the work I do in Colorado, is that there is an opportunity for you all to bring folks together, much like on the screen, and to create a review board of some sort that can look at and review the different areas that we're talking about here. You've got enough academics in the state of California alone to be able to help you all sit down and figure out, and Jack did a spot on job. What are the definitions? How are we defining this? What does the curriculum look like that's coming from LAPD versus Sacramento? And are these things we would stand next to and share and scale up in other areas throughout the state? So I think there is an opportunity for Post to step up, to create some new sort of areas for focus and bring people in who are doing this work on a daily basis. You can have groups of people who can evaluate those things and lift them up as examples that others can use, either for curriculum, for outcomes, for evidence-based, evidence-influenced. All of those things need to be made into what I always consider to be sort of packageable things for most law enforcement to use. Most agencies are not the size of LAPD and NYPD. And they don't have the staff, nor do they have the funds to do what needs to be done. And I think that there is a huge opportunity for Post to step up and create those things that they can, I think, stand next to and allow agencies to tap into Post for those questions that can't be asked or answered, whether or not what we're doing is having the desired effect. So I think there's plenty of opportunity, and I think there's lots of things you could think of to do. And I'm hoping that this is only the beginning of this conversation, and this is something that you all continue.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Officer Marvel and then Lieutenant Cortez. And then I believe next is Professor Owens and then Professor Lopez.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I really want to appreciate Luann and Tracy's remarks. I agree with a lot of what they're saying. And I think one of the things in regards that I wish Post would look at is the ongoing training that we currently receive. It's just across the board. I've been given some thought and consideration of officers have experience levels. The training, I've been on 22 years. The training I get is the same as somebody who's been on 1 or 2 years. Maybe it's a time we take a look at that and start to differentiate the level of experience and knowledge somebody has on the department versus the continuing training that they receive. An officer that's 22 years on doesn't need the training that somebody's been on maybe 1 to 5. I think this would be really good if we could maybe reassess the ongoing training that officers get based on their experience and knowledge they have on the department, because the patrol officers are going to need something that investigative units are going to need. Granted, some of the ongoing training, the first aid, I think is across the board. And then one other item is driving. I know we get a lot of, training on the driving, but PORAC is the largest legal defense fund in the United States. Driving crashes are the number 3 issues facing law enforcement in the United States. So I don't know about reducing it, but maybe we could increase the training in a sense of maybe look at what exactly are the issues officers are facing on the streets in their car crashes, to maybe better prepare for the ongoing training that we're providing on an annual basis.
Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to speak here. Again, all these views are my own, not my department's or the university or the commissions that I represent. First, I want to say, and hopefully everyone recognizes, that California Post has done an incredible job and leads this country in these issues of officer training. And I want to acknowledge that, and the fact that we have many police officers who are dedicating themselves to the research informed versus research based training. However, we are still police officers who are trying to ensure that this training is going in the direction we want to. And the points I want to make is to recognize that education takes time. We have a lot of outside influences coming in and trying to place a lot of the training and education into the academy. The academy is the best place to put it because that is the most cost efficient at this time. However, we need to look at that, much like Brian was talking about, is making this a career-long education program and not just something that happens as the mandated hours come out. I truly appreciate what my colleagues have said here, every single one of them, and to be as pinpoint as possible from what we need from the state is that board who can dedicate themselves to looking across the entire state and identifying what the local needs are, as well as the regional and state level. And ultimately, it's a nationwide issue with law enforcement education, that they can do the research, circle back and find out what is working, what's not working, and inform all the smaller departments on how to ensure we're going forward and making that those courses progress over time and meeting the officers where they are, not where the base standard is, and continuing to grow. I said this before, language has become the barrier to legitimacy in some of our training. I think Post can do a great, help us create that language and equate it to what our academic standards are, so we can go forward and show that and highlight the training and education that we have in law enforcement to ensure that it is, we're speaking the same language and we're explaining what our training is, and we're holding people to the standard that is an academic standard, because this is getting into academics, not just training. So I hope I didn't miss anything that I wanted to say, because everyone's been saying a lot of stuff and I've been taking notes and getting off my mark, but I really want to thank everyone for their words, and I hope that we can have some deliberate, purposeful training. And I don't want to miss the fact that Post has been doing a very deliberate and purposeful training, and I hope that we can build upon that so we can be the model for all other law enforcement agencies.
So I'd like to jump in here for just a minute and sort of focus, and not to put Post on the spot, but I do know that there are representatives of Post that are here. And I do want to emphasize what Lieutenant Cortez has just said, and others, when you were speaking about the good job that Post has been doing. I saw a lot of heads nodding. And so I'd like to have Post, if somebody is interested in interjecting, and how do you feel the training has been going? And given what you've heard so far, is there a way that you believe at Post that we can integrate some of these ideas about maybe looking back and saying that we maybe have too much training on driving? I happen to have grown up in LA, went to Secret Service training and was very good, because I grew up in LA and I was driving, since I was able to basically allowed to do that lawfully. So I'm just curious if Post has anything to add to what you're hearing here in ways that we might look at the training, or what you believe and think is currently how your training is going. So just putting that out there as part of the discussion.
Thank you.
I can't see tomorrow if anyone's jumping in, so.
So Director Alvarez, please.
No, thank you for the question and the opportunity to hear all the comments. Very greatly appreciated. I think there is, first of all, I almost agree with what everyone has said so far. I would like to address just a couple of the points where we've done well and some of the areas that are there for room for improvement, and just some recommendations based on the discussion so far. So I believe what Professor Owens talked about with, determining what you were trying to do, the outcome, and then building training to it. I think in certain areas we have done a great job, and I'll give you an example of that because it's been part of a recent discussion. And this is a credit to my predecessors and to some of my colleagues, which are still here. The patrol physical fitness requirements for patrol officers, that study was done early on across the state. There was a significant research done in a job task analysis that determined what were the physical requirements, or what are the physical requirements that are needed for your standard patrol officer. And then physical fitness testing requirements were built around that. That's ideal. That takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, and takes a lot of research. That's where we do hit the mark. But generally speaking, we don't do that. It is quantitative as opposed to qualitative or outcome based. So there is an enormous amount of room for improvement in that regard. I am a very, very big believer that academia can assist us with some of the research, and we welcome that. I think one of the challenges, which I brought up during the initial forum where I testified, and I think it was echoed by the professor from Washington State, is I think there is a reluctance from some entities and some agencies to provide data that is needed for that research because it becomes available to the masses. That is, I believe, a stumbling block. And I've heard that from professors on the East Coast that have said there's not a lot of data because of this reluctance to provide it. There should be a mechanism that academia or Post can collect data for research purposes to improve training. That doesn't exist today. And then the last thing I think that Officer Marvel spoke about, and I spoke about as well, is that training continuum, that it should be a ladder. It should be at the 1 year mark, this is the type of training you receive. At the 5 year mark, this is the type of training you receive. I believe, and I got this early on from Dr. Pinnell at LAPD, I believe that they were already starting down that path. And I know there is a lot of other entities outside the state of California that have done that, where they bring the officers back at the 2 year mark, at the 5 year mark, and provide advanced training to them as they progress through their careers. I am in complete agreement that that is something that would be of huge benefit to everybody. But again, it is very costly to do, to bring officers back, as opposed to shoving them into the academy, as Lieutenant Cortez brought up. That's where everything ends up, it seems like. So I appreciate the comments. Those are my 2 cents, just based on what I've heard thus far from the group. And again, I just truly appreciate being able to hear the comments. Thank you, Madam.
Okay, I have Professor Glaser and Professor Lopez. But before we get started, I would like to just throw out one other question, and that is kind of getting back to some of the specifics. We've talked about perhaps there's a need for an evidence review board to support Post. Perhaps there's a need to bring in thought leaders from other professions, or to add in staff with expertise in adult learning and curriculum development. And so my question in thinking about some of these options is, perhaps for Post or perhaps for anybody else on the panel, what actually would this take? What would it require? What would some of these changes look like as we're thinking about, what support would we need to augment for post to be able to enact some of these reforms? So I'll leave that out.
Well, the comment I was going to make, I think, speaks to this a little bit, and so I'm going to jump in now. I first also want to just reiterate Dr. Kazee and Dr. Pinelli's points that, really before we add new training, I think it would be worthwhile for post to start with evaluating what is currently done. And one thing that I think that post should try to do is try to maximize, what resources exist within the state of California already. And in particular, I'm glad that this is already brought up, but taking advantage of the University of California system, and in particular, the California Policy Lab, which is a partnership that's headed by UC Berkeley and UCLA, which sort of exists in order to help state and local government agencies figure out answers to their problems. And something that the Cal Policy Lab has is actually like secure data infrastructure. And so some of these questions about data confidentiality and, if a department shares data, is that releasing it to the world? Data security has come a long way, right? Even in the past 10 years. And partnering with, taking advantage of the University of California system and potentially the California Policy Lab, could be a good way forward to not have to reinvent the wheel. That could allow for, even smaller agencies that don't have the budget of, the LAPD, for example, to take advantage of some of this. I also want to point out that California is increasingly starting to collect data on what officers do in the field through the Racial Identity and Profiling Act of 2015. And so there is, officer identified information on stops, not all stops, but a fair number of stops that officers make of civilians, which is a much wider, there's still sort of, down funnel measures, it's an enforcement stop, but there is existing data increasingly on how officers are engaging with civilians that is officer identified, that is sort of set up to link to training that officers have gone through, right? And observe if this changes over time. So there are some options out there that are perhaps cheaper and more effective and already exist beyond like hiring Google to translate, millions of hours of ADL or body camera footage.
And I'll just continue what Professor Owens was saying, which is the California Policy Lab is a great idea, and they've already made inroads in developing data sharing MOUs with major police departments in the state. So they're in a good position to help with that. And the data sharing, the data collection is improving because of RIPA, and also now the state is ramping up its collection of use of force data statewide as well, which will go beyond what URSIS has been doing and will be better than that. So there will be better data. My general feeling on this subject is that the opportunity for post to collaborate with academic researchers is really tremendous. And whether it's through the California Policy Lab or through individual agreements or some combination of the two, the notion that post, which serves at a state level capacity and touches, to my understanding, all 450 or so agencies within the state, the possibility for fairly systematic research to actually compare different regimes of training, or at least compare new regimes to the status quo, and look at real outcomes in the field, either using RIPA data or other new data being collected. That there's really great potential there, and I think academics like myself and others on this call would be happy to help out with the design of those kinds of studies, because I think that would get back to this initial issue that's been coming up over and over, which is what's the effect of the training on the actual outcomes in the field. And there's really a lot of opportunity to do that. It's not going to be easy. It's never easy. And I hope that Professor Lopez will comment on this as well, because I think that's exactly, as you mentioned, Christy, that's exactly what they're trying to do with the ABLE program. to go beyond just the traditional kind of evaluation of police training programs, but to actually look at the difference that it's making in the field. And that's, extremely encouraging.
Yeah, it is one of the things I'm excited about as someone who's done a lot of work in my 25 years of this work, trying to measure the impact of various police interventions. And it's very, very complex. I think the ability to measure the impact of ABLE is not only going to be important to letting us know where and how ABLE has the best impact and the most influence, but also on how to better study and get better at how we even study the impact of any police training intervention, given how complex it is. And I suspect it's going to be a kind of an iterative growing process, and we will contribute to our piece, and others will as well. I just wanted to, I apologize if this is too abstract, but I was reminded of it by Dr. Kaziz's statement that, the kinds of training that communities are demanding. And one of the things that I think it's important to keep easy to get kind of very focused on the nuts and bolts of the training. And I think it's useful sometimes to step back and remember some of these, and you can frame them in terms of outcomes. I think of them in terms of questions. For a long time, when we were talking about police training, we were talking about what makes the training effective. And that was a particularly fraught question, especially given that there's never been agreement on what successful or good policing really looks like. And so, that's a pretty basic thing that we don't actually have agreement on. Certain fields might think we have agreement on that, and they and all their friends might, but we don't have a broad societal agreement on what good or effective policing is. And so it's hard to even say that the training we are doing is bringing about effective policing. But communities now are demanding much more than that. They're, training no longer seen as a presumptive good. They want to know towards what end. We're pouring millions into training. What are we getting for that? And I think that to answer that question, I think that what Post and anybody really trying to develop training, there's a few questions you need to be able to answer and kind of build into your outcomes. I think one of them is will this training promote positive, transformative culture change in policing? And that includes culture change that decreases the harm that policing has on marginalized group, whether those are people of color, immigrants, persons in mental health crisis. That has to be part of what you're thinking, both in terms of what training you're offering and developing and how you're measuring the outcomes of it. And you should expect communities to ask you that question and be ready to answer that question with facts. The second question, I think, is will this training teach skills that prevent and reduce policing harm? And I think this kind of goes to what Professor Glaser was talking about with the implicit bias training. That awareness building training is very important, but I think both what we've seen with ABLE is that authors very much appreciate getting actual skills and actually learning that muscle memory and how am I going to actually do this in the field? How can I use this every day? And communities expect that too. What are the skills you're actually teaching that's going to change how policing happens? And you should know that, and you should know how to measure that. And then finally, can this training be expected to help ameliorate or at least not exacerbate race disparities in policing? I just think that has to be a standalone question that we have to always be attentive to. And you have to, for too long, we've not asked, well, hey, if we train officers to do this, how do we expect them to use it? Is it going to increase disparities or not increase disparities? What impact will it have? We just have to make that part of the analysis when we're deciding what training to offer and how we measure it. So those are super general. They obviously need to be more granular when you're applying them to particular training, but I found it very useful to sort of think about those writ large to kind of keep you on the right track of how you not only develop and design training, but measure whether it's effective.
Dr. Pennell?
So just a couple of things to bring to this conversation, because of course we're all focused on training, but I think there is a paradox within policing as well, that officers are, who's a good officer? A good officer is one who makes a lot of arrests. There's certain things that get counted in policing and get counted in CompStat and other places where people are held accountable that don't have to do with outcomes in training. So one of the other areas that I think collectively we have to, as we've been looking at some of the training that we've been doing, how do we measure quality of contact? And we measure how many arrests you got, but within that arrest, did you demonstrate procedural justice? How did you do that? we are trying at a supervisor level and with our field training officers to look at body camera review, and how do you help review with your officers the quality of your training or of your contact within a traffic stop, for example, and not just that you were tactically sound, but that also it was legal and that you were following the policies and procedures, but also what did you do to leave a trust bridge out of that contact? That's extra time, extra, all of that is not typically, so it's one of the things that we're training against is that the systems and everything that officers are evaluated on are often different than your training outcomes. And to some extent that if we can bring that to light as a shared body that, but then, most chiefs of police are going to say, well, what do you want me to count? I'm supposed to count arrests. I'm supposed to count crime, but how, and I don't think, if in some way our academic partners can also help us with that measurement, because that is something that every chief of police is graded on kind of. And so I have difficulty coming back with a great answer much of the time. I know some of our evaluations could be better. Or even, our annual evaluations could be better, but there's some things that training loses its impact because you have other systems in play that have greater rewards than the training that we've given. And that's a challenge.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation so far. Just keeping mindful of the time, I want to move us on to the second half of the agenda, which actually is building on some comments that we've already raised about, perhaps the need to scale learning for officers throughout a career, or to build in some additional training for officers. This was a theme that had come up throughout our hearings, and also something that came up in our survey that we recently issued of California's law enforcement officers, was just that there's this need to emphasize additional skills that have not been emphasized, which was something we've talked about a little bit already today. And also that we need more training opportunities. So at this point now, I'd like to just throw out at you thinking a little bit more, expanding on Officer Marvel's comment about how are we going to elongate this training opportunities for officers. What would that actually look like? I can say that some other ideas that have been thrown out are to imagine a sort of second academy experience for California's officers, to have officers return to some sort of standardized learning, and perhaps that's different from what's in the basic academy. And so I want to throw that out as something that, to see if that's something that you think would be effective or useful. Or another option, should we mandate additional training for California's officers to fill in some of these needs? So I'll just throw that out to the group for now.
I think while people are thinking about that, I want to also come back to, I think, which was a very fundamental point of what is it we're training for? And I think you all have touched on that in various ways about, what is it that police chiefs are counting and why? What is it that we're training for? Is it for a meaningful interaction with law enforcement to build that trust in that community, or is it I arrested somebody? And so I think that as we talk about what Tamar just asked about other types of training paths, also should we also be focused on our definition of what it is that our mission is? And I know that this is a loaded question as I say that, but is that part of what may be missing with our training is we don't collectively agree as to what we're training for. So I put that out there as part of this discussion, because I think it probably will guide us to, how best to to make recommendations about training and what maybe post should or shouldn't be doing or can expand. So I put that out there as part of our discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Commissioner Sidley. Chief Lewis?
Thank you, Tamara. Just to maybe develop to your comments, Commissioner Sidley, I agree. I think that the thing that we're talking about here in this discussion, and I want to frame this a little bit in a little bit larger context, because I think it's important to all the things that we're talking about here. And I think that, as you mentioned, ma'am, trust is the center of the bullseye in policing, okay? And so are we training for trust? And how do we do that? And I would argue that if we trust our police officers to be good communicators and problem solvers and to make good decisions, that is all rooted in our critical thinking skills. And are we training for that specifically? And so I think that when we're asking this question, what are we training for and what are the outcomes that we are looking at? I think we have to look at it in a little bit broader context, because we do a good job from a practical standpoint of teaching people to operate vehicles safely, in marksmanship, in criminal law. I think we do a very good job with that. But I think that all those things, when it comes to the moment of decision, right, it's important that we have these critical thinking skills and that we're continuing to grow and develop in that aspect. And the reason why I point to this is when we hire police officers, this is a people business, right? We do a very good job of analyzing their skill sets in a background investigation. There's been a lot of talk about the age that we bring police officers into the business and the education level that we perhaps mandate. And I think that when we're looking at a whole person and in a background and we're bringing them into law enforcement, we do a very good job of evaluating whether or not these are people we think are going to make good decisions and are going to have good judgment and are going to be mature, reasonable, thinking individuals on the street. But where I think that we can improve is how, and this is to Officer Marble's point, is how we continue to support that over the course of their careers. And I think that one thing that we need to look at is that we can wave a magic wand, I guess, but we don't have that magic wand. I look at this from a practical standpoint is how do we do this now? How do we look at our existing processes, our existing systems, our existing resources? And what I'm lifting up here to you is that we have those in place. I think that we could develop them to support this. And one thing I will throw out from our folks from Post here, we have basic, intermediate, and advanced post certificates, but I think that we could develop those certification levels in a way that supports these important larger concepts that I'm talking about. So it's not just that you have X amount of years on the job and you have X amount of post-certified classes allows you to receive a basic certificate. Do we mandate that a basic certificate, we require additional training and we do it maybe something, and it can be very academic based. And I think that there's something that is important to that conversation as well. Something that is out of the policing world, that we have someone from the community, from academia come in and talk to us about critical thinking, about logic, about reason, right? And tailor that for those individuals at that time in their career. Because our officers that are 3 years, 4 years, 5 years on the job are going to see the world very, very differently than our 20 and 25-year veterans. And I think that we need to be nimble and we need to be flexible and we need to understand our audience here in our training. I think that that's an area that we can definitely improve in. So I would throw that out to you. I think that I would like to see this conversation in a little bit broader context to really focus on how we address those. And we also talk about, when we're talking about a whole person concept with our officers, I think there's an opportunity here too to focus on wellness and resiliency over the careers of our officers too. And I think that that's something that we can build in. If we look at those, again, I'm a process person. I believe in systems, and I think we have the systems there, but I think that we can develop those in a way that can support this initiative in a broader context. So thank you for letting me make those comments, ma'am.
Thank you. Professor Glaser.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I just want to build on what Chief Lewis and Commissioner Sidley just said and just add one detail, which is to say that a trend that I see emerging in academic research on policing and advocacy is exploring community perceptions of public safety and incorporating actual, what the community that's being policed believes are the priorities for their own safety, and then having a dialogue between city managers and council people and police leaders about that, so that when we go looking for those outcomes of interest, they actually jibe with what the people being policed think, they should be. So that's just another dimension to that discussion.
So thank you, Chief Lewis. I think what Brian was also saying about, and I was saying about the life or the career-long learning process. We've made extreme leaps and bounds with online education. I know it's not the best for many people, it's debated. But I remember going through SLI and when I was with people from other organizations, it helped me understand what I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I don't understand many politics outside of my organization. And it was able to help. It was able to help bridge that gap between academics and practical application when we were able to bring in academics and also relate it to the real world experiences that we were dealing with as supervisors. I think that is something that needs further exploration of bringing in a way that we can connect the officers with other officers at the same time frame of work and the same types of positions throughout the state, so they can expand their knowledge base in what they are working towards, which is that ultimately needs to be defined at what is effective. But those critical skills of the critical thinking, the understanding of other aspects outside of the case laws and what is a good arrest or a lawful arrest or trial preparation. It needs to be those subject matters that are in the academic world, and you can bring together many different people from outside of law enforcement in academics, also community-based leaders that can come in and with the online setting, much like we're here, being able to get a wide range of people in the same virtual room to explore those ideas and enhance our ability to understand what we don't understand. I think that POST, again, has put together good curriculum, has done a great job with SLI, with DLI, and other aspects in partnering with academic institutions. And I think we can further enhance that. To Chief Lewis's point, it needs to be done now. It needs to be something we look at now, and it can't be the one-offs. LAPD has done a great job about circling back with the class as a whole and understanding where they are, but they're in a couple hundred square miles, and they can bring in their different perspectives that help each other grow. Unfortunately, many of the police departments don't have that ability. So being able to do it even in a virtual setting will help us expand our knowledge base and our growth as a profession.
All right, we've got Professor Owens and then Officer Marvel.
Yeah, I would like to build on something Chief Lewis mentioned, but also what I remember, Manny Alvarez talking about in his first testimony, and then what also came up in the third training session about this focus on officer wellness, right? And sort of figuring out how POST responds to the enormous stress that officers are under just as a daily, just part of their jobs. I think that another question that has come up is sort of, who should POST be training and training on what? And I think officer wellness is an interesting example of that, where you can train officers in like stress management, but really I think there's a real role for an officer's supervisors in receiving training and identifying officers who are perhaps not going to be able to problem solve, right, because of the stress that they're under, right, or who could identifying those warning signs that I don't think are traditionally part of typical early intervention systems, right, but identifying officers who are under so much stress that they're not going to be able to make unbiased decisions, right, or decisions that aren't responding in the heat of the moment, where they're going to have a hard time making tactical pauses. So training, something that's also come up that I want to reiterate, is if you train officers in the academy and they go meet with their field training officer who tells them to forget everything you ever learned in their academy, because here's how it actually works, here's how you're actually evaluated, the training's not going to do anything. And so in terms of something that POST could do in assessing its existing programs and also thinking about who to train, is that it is important to train officers in the skills and things that we think they need to do the types of policing that we want. It's also important to train the person who is setting the on-the-job incentives of the officer, right? The supervisor, the person who's going to be determining, if they get a commendation or if they are going to be in the back of the line, so that the person who is like in charge of the officer's daily tasks understands why an officer might be trained in a particular way. Yes.
Yeah, so I just want to dovetail what Joseph had spoken about. First off, I want to plus one the kudos to Post. I think Manny and the staff over there are doing a fantastic job. I really appreciate all of the work that they do. Very receptive to input and talking to law enforcement and community members around the state. But to go back to Joseph's comments about SLI and officer exchanges, I think this would be a great opportunity for Post to take a look at where are officer exchanges working? Are there any other states in the union currently doing that? Because I really do think that's a huge positive if we can get officers from other departments to maybe spend time with other agencies just to see what they're doing, to bring it back maybe best practices or something that was unique that really helped improve that trust within the community to their own agency. And I do understand the ramifications of some of the smaller agencies having an extreme difficulty to do that versus the larger agencies in the state. But an officer exchange program, I think, would be a huge plus. And I think Post is well positioned to look at a program like that, create it. But I do think it would take legislation from the state of California to make it happen, unless the chiefs are willing to step up and voluntarily try to figure out a way of doing that throughout the state. So those are pretty much my comments for supporting what Joseph said.
All right, Commissioner Braziel, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I want to try and rope you into the conversation here. And I'm just curious.
You're throwing me under the bus.
When we spoke earlier, you talked a little bit about some of the support that Post might need to make some of these changes. And I was just wondering if you could bring some of that into the conversation today.
Sure. First of all, thanks to Manny. For those that don't know Post pre-Manny, it was stuck, quite honestly, in the way of doing daily business. And the commission actually brought Manny in to shake things up and change Post and bring in new leadership and change what we do in treating the agencies and the community as customers. And he's been able to do that. But in doing so, we have taxed the staff tremendously. So I wrote down a lot of great ideas here, but I do know there's not enough staff to get it done in the process. We still have all the legal mandates that are in law that we have to push, plus the new ones coming down. And I see Meagan on, and she tracks all those. So we're constantly, the commission, constantly evaluating how much more can we push the commission and the staff to get things done at a time when change is the constant in the process. So one of the things that we need to rely on as a commission and Post as staff, and it came back to some of the question, this is the great question, is, what training do we need? Is we really need the organizations out there, the LAPDs all the way to the Del Nortes with very few people in the middle of, the uppermost part of the state, to become learning organizations and to share what they learn with others. We're looking for, we're looking at evidence-based stuff. We're also looking at best practices and what's working from what's not working. And when you look at, one of the things that we do well in government is we just keep reinventing the wheel. And we already talked about going to the policy group, but there's all kinds of other organizations out there that are already doing a ton of research across the country, from the Police Foundation to IR, the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. VCPI in Virginia has, that's the Center for Policing Innovation, has put a ton of programs out there. And it's the ability for organizations to go out and tap into those and then bring them back and create some kind of shared network that either Post, I don't want to say manages it, but it's kind of a collective that brings stuff together to look at best practices and start reaching out, looking at other organizations that are doing things differently than the way we're used to doing them. The one thing, and I'm just going to throw government under the bus, and it was brought up earlier in policing in particular, we're not the most creative group out there. We're not super imaginative. We aren't looking for new ways of doing business. We're accustomed to going out and doing the same thing all the time. And what Lieutenant Cortez brought up is when you mix classes, whether it's SLI, command college, the management course, when you're mixing, particularly when it comes to supervisors, sergeants, lieutenants, captains together, and they start learning from each other, you start stealing best practices. And you may want to call it something different, but don't reinvent the wheel. So it really is one of those, when we ask what training is missing, we're really, I'm focused less on the line employees and more on how do we develop leaders in law enforcement that create learning organizations that are willing to try something new, knowing that it might not work exactly, but have the courage and guts to go try it to see if it's going to better serve their community and better serve their employees along the way. So I throw that out there. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of good conversation. I wrote a lot of notes. I know Manny and staff are writing a bunch of notes, knowing there's going to be a bunch of to-dos that come back. But honestly, staff's tapped at post with all the legal mandates, plus all kinds of other stuff that we as commissioners push forward to them. So we rely on groups like you, and I wrote some of your names down. I'll contact you later for some really creative ideas and how we as this group become part of a bigger solution and not just throwing out, so here's some ideas, let's go make it happen. So I'll be quiet for a while.
Dr. Pennell.
Thank you. So just a couple comments, because I think we find that people expect us to have something that looks like Minority Report, where we're throwing information across the wall, and really it's more like 3x5 cards sometimes. It's just, but I was not sure even if it would help host, but one of the challenges that other people might not realize, we have some mandates that are annual, some that are every second year, every 3 years, and every 5 years. So tracking that for every single officer, and I don't know if there's a way to push reminders through EDI or through the PORAC portal to our people that, like if you just had a calendar in there or something that said, you're 6 months away from being out of compliance with your, it's all computer based. So it just seems like there should be something that would help us. But I'm sure we get taxed by that. And then you got to come back around and audit us and tell us if we're there. I just wonder if some of our computer systems could help us a little better. The other thing, I just wanted to mention a couple areas that I thought that are pressing forward and changing policing. And one is social media. And I don't know about any other department, but our department, mostly our social media policy is everything not to do. Please don't post anything stupid. Don't post anything that's going to get you or a friend fired. But it's not so much about how to, what should police officers do in the world of social media? They all have it. And then when does it start to cross a line between your personal Instagram and now that's a personal and professional, and we've had so many cases on that. I just wonder if there's like even a thinking about how should policing be best using social media, and even just a course that is specifically on how to message and market our message better. Or, one of our interns told me that, that our social media is just, not so good, and partly we train you in handcuffing, we train you in a whole bunch of things, but social media, and then when somebody steps over a line, then we're going to hammer them for doing that. So, how do we, are there any parameters in that in the state of California, or is there a best practices working group on social media and how to use it? The other thing I would say similarly is body worn video. And I realize not every agency has it, but I don't think that is something that's going away. And I would love for us to be at the forefront of how to best use body video, that we're not just in a kind of body memory. Okay, I can turn a button on and off, but how do we best use it investigatively, collaboratively for communication? And because certainly people are going to watch our body video before they ever read a report. So officers might know that they absolutely knew that there was a weapon in the house, but nobody sees that on the video and they go barred, however that plays out. So to the extent that we have, we're trying to train our officers more and more to narrate as they go through things and articulate their thought process, because it just helps them all along. It also, so I just throw that out there in terms of best practices or how we could help each other, because I think both of those things aren't going away. And then equally the hardiness and resiliency. We're trying to weave that throughout our training. Lastly, I would say if I had a wish list, if we could develop training, what is the training we need for the first 5 years, and then turn on that switch that goes every 2 years, we have the post training. Because I look at most professions, we put our youngest and newest people out on the front lines. And I think the last we looked, I think 60% of LAPD officers have 5 years on and less in the front lines, right? We've had a lot of movement. So I keep thinking of how to best develop. And so that's why we created that course where we bring people back. I recognize that not every agency could do that, and that might be a hardship for some, but you kind of look at, well, what can we do now? And I appreciate Chief Lewis, what can we do now to move into that space? But I think the old paradigm was that you had to be on longer and earn your way to advanced training. But really we're asking those frontline officers to do the bulk of that frontline work. So what we could do to support them in the first 5 years, maybe some of those things become mandatory milestones if I had my magic wand, but I know that might be easier said than done. So, and then finally, just a shout out to Post, because yes, they have supported us and many of us here in developing and being encouraged to develop things that are out of the box, or to be creative in what we're doing to meet the needs of our departments. And so I just wanted to echo that before I sign off.
This is Pedro Navas. Thanks for, and I apologize. It looks like I interrupted you, Commissioner Sidley, but I just thought for Dr. Pinnell, I just had this headline come across my phone of LA Times: police wanted poster moved to social media, nabbing suspects and ruining lives. So it sounds to me as though you really are clued into something that really needs to be paid attention to, because it's obviously part of a special report in the LA Times. So there's going to be more conversation about it. Sorry, Commissioner Sidley.
No, I find this discussion to be fascinating, and I think I want to put out another provocative idea for the group. We're all talking about police training because we need to serve the community and do what the community expects of us, and what that means, what the community does expect from us. And what I don't know is whether or not anyone thinks that bringing members of the community to police training, to post training, to have that understanding so that everyone's in the same room. Look, I understand that obviously resources and money, it's a huge problem, and we need to be able to train our officers and spend what limited resources we have in appropriate manner. But is there value in bringing people from the community into this training and into the discussion? And is that something that may or may not be helpful to overall, addressing the issue of trust in moving forward, to understand what training is, what training isn't, what are our people told to do out there on the streets? I just put that out there as maybe part of the discussion, if anyone has thoughts about that as well.
I'll leave that for to digest. Officer Bowie, I'm going to throw you on the under the bus too, just like I did your post colleague. I just want to make sure that we're hearing from everybody here today, and just wanted to give you the opportunity to share any thoughts or reactions to the conversation, especially since we've been talking about so many potential changes for posts for the commission potentially.
Hi, thank you for including me in this conversation. And to be honest with you, it is a little intimidating to be here amongst all the academics, the PhDs, the executives. So I'm speaking to you from a line officer position and perspective. I think that Dr. Pinnell, said something very striking to me earlier related to what do we value? When I started in 1994, what we valued then is quite different from what we value now, not just in policing, but in the community and what they expect from us. So, I mean, you go from why did why do officers go into this profession? I mean, we see ourselves as warriors, and that's changing to, the guardian. Do we see ourselves just as law enforcement officers, or are we shifting that to seeing ourselves as public safety officers? So there's a big difference there. And when you go in with how you see yourself, it will change the way you perform as a police officer, right? How you interact with people. So my ask of this commission or this group here is that, as officers, we can be a little skeptical, and throughout our career, we might even become a little cynical because of the bubbles that we work in. So we're going to want to know the why. Why are we going down this path? Why are we receiving this training? How did it come about? And so, and we'd like to be included in the review of, it might look really good on paper, but is it practical for us on the street? Does it translate well for the police officer? That's my ask.
Professor Glaser and then Lieutenant Cortez.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, Officer Bowie, your voice is the most important and valid voice here as far as I'm concerned. So, and please don't be intimidated by PhDs. I just wanted to quickly respond to what Commissioner Sidley brought up, and to say that I think there is, and since I brought this up earlier as well, getting the community perspective on what public safety is, I do think that there's value in having community members, civilians involved in the training development process. But I think the more fundamental issue is really, how do we identify what training is effective? And I don't see community members being any better at that than the rest of us. So I would not look to that as a solution to that problem, but they will identify what's important to the community. But I do think more fundamentally, we really just need to figure out what are the outcomes and how do we measure them.
To the commissioner, civilians are heavily, and they should be heavily involved in not only the police training, but the understanding of what police training is and education is. I think that, as our colleagues here have said, that there are community academies. We run several community academies, and ones are in other languages as well. However, when it comes to what I've seen and have done at the university level as a professor is, in my undergrad class, I authored Crime and Public Policy. How does public policy impact crime, and how does crime impact public policy? But the number one thing I see is a transition between the understanding at the beginning of the course to the end of the course of what is deterrence theory, what is the role of law enforcement and what they're doing. And I found that a lot of community members do not know. And having the dialogue of panelists that I bring in with a diverse level of federal, state, local politicians and law enforcement officers and supervisors is that they have a better understanding at the end of the class, and that they can go home and be advocates for what we're doing in education. So as I said before, in the ongoing training, or again, I don't like using the word training, I like using education, because it is, as we go through the furtherance of our education of our officers and our command staff. And I think that also includes members of the public as well. And that could be separate from what each officer goes through, but it is a very important part for us all to have an understanding that that is just as important. If it's not something we put on the post, another thing we put on the post, which I don't want to, but it is having that understanding and that awareness set of what we are training and educating our officers, our command staff, our supervisors about. But we cannot leave out the community members. And that is something that my career-long education plan in my mind definitely includes members of all parts of the community, not just those who really want to get involved and sign up for the community academies. And that's somehow a dream of mine to incorporate them. And knowing that education takes time, That's going to take the 30-year career, but through that career, we don't need to be sprinting through an academy to learn everything. It is through time that we can bring people in, have them identify kind of where they're at in their career. And that's when they need to be speaking with community members and understand the dynamics that are happening out there.
Commissioner Byer, it looks like you have something to add.
Yes, thank you. I actually want to commend Commissioner Sidley for her idea, but put a maybe perverse twist on it. It seems to me as though one of the core problems is that the funding agencies for police departments, that is members of city councils or county boards of supervisors, actually don't know a whole lot about police and police functions. One of the things that we've done in the hospital where I'm on the board is board members get trained in safety protocols at the hospital, because we measure safety outcomes and we measure them very, very precisely. Was an IV put in correctly? Was there a certain kind of adverse outcome? But we train members of the board of directors so that they can relate to what the physicians, the nurses' assistants are doing. And frankly, I think there would be a lot better dialogue if the responsible public officials had a better appreciation of the mission of police officers and the conflicts that they face. Because right now, I think a lot of negative attention is focused on the police, and improving police training won't improve the communication between the agencies. We have the expectations that police are going to change through training, but rather that there has to be an ongoing conversation about reform of who's doing what. That is, more mental health workers to do community health interventions as opposed to using police officers for medical or behavioral interventions. Anyway, that's my spin on Commissioner Sidley's suggestion, is train the civilians who have the bucks.
All right, it looks like we're about wrapping up. I'd like to just, before we go on to our closing statements and public comments, I just want to give everybody an opportunity. If there's anything else you'd like to add to the conversation for the commission to think about as it begins to, process all this information and think about recommendations for how we can support the profession, improve training, and support post. Just open that up for last comments, and it looks like we have Chief Lewis.
I just want to develop a little bit on Commissioner Braziel's point to post. And I think we have to be realistic from a practical standpoint about what we're asking post to do here. And his point here is very valid. And so I would submit that, well, we've heard some great ideas. I mean, I'd like to get to maybe past a way where we're talking about, what's ideal here and what we can actually do. And I think that resources have to be a part of that discussion. And those are going to be some tough conversations because we're all going to be competing for them. And so I would suggest that I think it will be important for us at some point I think we can agree in a general sense about some of the items that we need to focus on in training, but now identifying how we're going to roll that out. I think the practical piece of this is something that we have to confront, we have to manage, and we have to resource. And I think that, having that discussion is one that I would suggest that we have in the future and sooner rather than later, humbly.
Thank you. Commissioner Braziel.
And I know this has come up before, but we've got a lot of diverse organizations from very, very small to very, very large, universities, sheriff's departments, police departments, transit. So there's a diverse group of providers that provide policing in the state. And it's not just about the officers carrying guns. The first person a victim or someone seeking help talks to is a dispatcher. And all the way through into the custody staff. So we just need to look all the way through the continuum as the commission focuses on your final report, going from large to small, and the whole continuum of service providers, because it is not just about the folks that carry the guns on the street. Thank you.
I just Yeah, I just want to echo that, and I put it into the chat earlier that we need to remember to include police dispatchers in the evaluation of training and the enhancement of training. Most of the times, police officers even dispatch to a call, but it's how they are treated or dealt with at that initial onset that makes a huge difference in perception as reality. And a lot of people that's in our communities, it's want us to address not only crime, but the fear of crime and how we articulate the non-dispatch or something in the eyes of our community members' needs, that we train our dispatchers and we evaluate those dispatch training models as well. So thank you for bringing that up again.
All right, Chairman Nava, Commissioner Sidley, it looks like that is the end of the remaining comments here today. If there's anything else you'd like to add for closing statements, then we'll move on to public comment. We've got about 46 folks in the audience and attendance here. In case any would like to make public comment, we'll provide instructions on how to do that in just a minute.
Well, just let me offer my apologies for having to leave the meeting for a period of time. As I mentioned, I did have to offer testimony at a Senate committee in support of a bill, but I'm absolutely convinced that you barely even noticed I was gone, given how well Commissioner Sidley was able to coordinate your conversations and the depth of her knowledge and her experience. She has consistently demonstrated a very sincere and profound commitment to the law enforcement, the community, law enforcement training, and how to continue to improve the nature of that relationship. And what I'm encouraged by is in large part the orientation of the public almost as customers. And when you talk about your dispatchers, that's the first point of contact many times for your customers as they become familiar with the law enforcement services that you provide. I had the advantage and the privilege to serve as a deputy district attorney in Fresno County for a number of years, and started out in the juvenile, prosecuting juveniles, although you don't prosecute juveniles, you kind of try to give them direction and guidance. And then moving into misdemeanors and then felonies. And at the end of my career as a prosecutor, I was the targeted narcotics deputy. And what I learned was there is just an incredible range of content that law enforcement has with the public, depending on what it is that they're presented with, and tremendous flexibility that law enforcement officers have to demonstrate. When you think about the age groups that law enforcement officers come in contact with, the kinds of stresses that those individuals are going under or experiencing, and I take again encouragement from the conversation about officer wellness. For too long, we have never really talked about the pressures that law enforcement officers experience and how we help them deal with those pressures and acknowledge them without it being pejorative. Without, we have to understand that law enforcement officers are asked to do the sorts of things that most people don't want to do. They're asked to see most things that most people don't want to see. They're asked to hear what most people don't ever want to hear. And that is an extraordinary level of stress that they undergo. And part of the training and part of understanding how to improve law enforcement is also appreciating how we empower and educate, not just training, as Mr. Cortez said, but educate officers so that they and the community begins to understand what an extraordinary service is provided. There have been incidents that people, I think, can look at and legitimately criticize. But given my experience, I would have to say the overwhelming number of times that officers come in contact with the public, they're favorable. And the communities that want law enforcement protection are oftentimes the same communities that are the most victimized. They're the ones that undergo tremendous pressure and impacts of crime. And I just think to myself, the sort of meeting that we just had here today, when's the last time that any of you had something like this, where you were able to sit virtually with people that are interested and invested in your profession and to have a frank conversation about how we go about making it better. So thank you all for the work that you do and your commitment. And thank you, Commissioner Sidley, for stepping in and making my absence the least noticed part of the meeting.
Commissioner Nava, thank you. And to everyone else, just to add, I also, I was a former assistant United States attorney where I obviously prosecuted cases. And also I worked as a Los Angeles city attorney, also prosecuting cases. So I do come to this, this issue with some personal experience. And I just want to thank everybody for your participation today and tell you that the commission does, overall, the Little Hoover Commission takes this issue very seriously. And, just echoing what Commissioner Nava has said, I want to emphasize the point that people have made about the limitation on resources. That rings true. That is something that we are very aware of. And so I want to say, I do not want our report to be something that causes more burden to post. We want it to be helpful. We're here with this discussion and these hearings to learn and to try to provide a path to be supportive, to take everybody to a level where the training is both productive, useful, and resource efficient. So just that summary. And again, I thank you all very much. And I do look forward to, if there's any public comment, hearing what the public has to say about our discussion as well.
Thank you so much, commissioners. And I will once again reiterate our thanks to all of the panelists today. I've had the privilege of speaking to each of you individually and have benefited from your ideas and expertise. And I think that a lot of those conversations came out today. So I appreciate your time and sharing, your willingness to share your ideas. That said, if there's anything else to add, please feel free to contact me as we continue to work through this study. And thank you again. So we will now turn to public comments. And there are a number of folks who are watching online. If any of you would like to make a comment before the commission, you may use the raise hand feature if you're following along on Zoom. And I believe we have some instructions here. If you're following along by phone, could you please send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov, and please do that as soon as possible. If you could include your comment or question as well as your name and the phone number from which you're calling from, so that we will know how to unmute you, that would be great. So we'll just give it a minute, see if there's any public comments. It looks like we have one. Actually, Rachel, I'll ask you if you're able to track this. Could you see if there's any public comment on our Zoom?
Yeah, so right now we have one public comment from Steve McNally. Steve, I'm unmuting you now and you can start your public comment.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I want to thank everyone who's here as a community member. It's exciting to see people talk about positive change, and I watched all of the law enforcement webinars. My main focus is mental health, and of course, police are very important in that arena. And from my vantage point, they're probably the more knowledgeable, more empathetic group, helping to address difficult situations. So I had a couple of comments. One was controlling the narrative. Sometimes getting things out into the public can be done. And I think it needs to be done because the narrative is being hijacked. The other is that many of the things that people are looking for are already being done in our big police departments. And I want to mention two programs, one in Houston where they did a PTSD program from the chief down years ago. And one was Placentia Yorba Linda teachers. I live in Orange County. They did the ACEs aware trauma with the teachers and found 20% of the teachers had trauma. So unresolved, unresolved childhood trauma as adults. And I think trauma is probably a big thing with police officers. And so I'm not sure about the cultures as far as recognizing the ability to be open and honest about those kinds of things. And then finally, I think the public doesn't have a good expectation of what an officer can do. So they do have a program much like the shooting. They have the one with de-escalation. And I think de-escalation with a mental health or a homeless person would be a perfect town hall for police departments, because the public has an unrealistic expectation of what happens when they come to your house. And in my county, they're required to come. If they change the policy, then they won't come, and some of the cities are taking that upon themselves to do it. So with that, I want to thank you. I've seen several of these people now, and I'm very excited about just the quality of the officers and the educators involved in this task. And I'm hoping when we look to legislation for some things, John Sharon in Los Angeles mental health will say they need flexibility and requirements to achieve outcomes. When you legislate too much, and what was said today about not knowing, we've had legislated requirements and we don't know what they're doing. Maybe there's a need for flexibility to give the officers the ability, or the chiefs the ability, to create the cultures and the environments that they want and not legislate it. So thanks again for letting the public participate. And I love what you guys do, and thank you very much.
Rachel, are there anyone else who's requested public comment?
So our next public commenter is the LWVSC admin. You may begin your public comment.
I'll just add this before you begin. I forgot to mention before, we'll have about 3 minutes per each public commenter. So if you could limit your remarks to 3 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Hello, actually my name is Norma Nelson. I didn't realize that was going to come up on the screen, but I am with the League of Women Voters of Sacramento County. And just want to, first of all, acknowledge the good work that you all have been doing today in terms of the discussion that I've heard. It's been very insightful, hearing the perspectives of different participants in this panel. Just want to also highlight that I found it very, some of the highlights anyway, I found it very interesting and thought it was a good idea, the suggestion from concerning actually providing some kind of orientation training for elected officials at the local level. Oftentimes, some of the issues of distrust between police departments and the community has to do with how the policies are being developed at the local level of city government. And so city officials better understanding the needs of the community and being able to balance their policies with the needs of the police department is something that would be very valuable. And a number of you talked about engaging the community more, like someone suggested perhaps the thought of having community-based leaders be a part of the post training. There were a number of suggestions around involving the community, so that was a good idea. Someone had mentioned early on, and I missed to mention it, about implicit bias training and its impact on evidence-based training, and looking at that a little bit more. in terms of its impact on making the transformative cultural changes that Christy mentioned. Absolutely essential that the critical thinking skills be an area of emphasis in police training throughout their career, with some of the suggestions that there be different levels of trainings at different, based upon there being a newbie versus intermediate or advanced police officer, and also around the issues of staffing shortages at posts, and even at the local agencies as well, looking at efficiencies to help address the staffing shortage issues is a good idea as well. And particularly when you all talked about today how some of the training might be a little bit antiquated or need to be updated, based upon what's important today. And so it was a lot of good information here. And not to forget that if we're focusing on evidence-based concepts as the rationale for making transformational changes, we probably should also look more at the best practices types of things that were talked about today. And we don't want to stifle innovation in terms of being able to make those types of transformational cultural changes that we need to make in law enforcement. And definitely looking at explicit and implicit bias in policing to address the racial disparities in policing. So a lot of good stuff here today, but those are just a couple of things. I don't want to take up more time and give an opportunity for others to speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rachel, are there any other requests for public comment on Zoom?
No, there are no more raised hands, and we have not received any emails.
All right, well, Chairman Nava, Commissioner Sidley, it looks like that is the end of public comment. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today. And more information about our study is on our website at littlehoover.ca.gov. And so you may follow us there. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.